everybody, and welcome to Meanwhile in the West, a video where I go through our local paper, the West Australian, and basically complain about some of the letters that have been written in it. So, without any further ado, this is the first letter is from the 20th of February. I wish to express my concern over the increasing violent incidents by asylum seekers, especially this latest attack at Manus Island. If this is their best behaviour to get into our country, then God help us all. People who cause a scene or damage at any of Australia's detention centres should be charged, fined and sent back to wherever they came from. John Beaver, Geraldton. Oh dear. John. So the problem here, of course, is that bloody asylum seekers in detention centres are not on their best behaviour to get into our country. They are fleeing persecution. They are deeply traumatised. They've usually, once they're in detention, have taken perilous sea journeys. They've then been deported to another country. Escorted to an Australian overseas detention camp. So they're not even in Australia, and you put all of that together and you think they're going to behave themselves. Oh my God. And then especially if we send them back to wherever they came from, right back into persecution. Good idea, John. Good idea. This is from the weekend, 22nd of February 2012. If we didn't have an extradition treaty with Indonesia, I would sneak Schapelle Corby out right now. I don't care if she did try to smuggle a boogie board full of pot. If she'd been caught here, she wouldn't have got 20 years in a hellhole like Koromakan. The sanctimonious amongst us want her to suffer even more for a silly mistake, a cruel and un-Australian. Let her profit from her story, I say. Chopper Reid did, and his crimes are far worse than Schapelle's. Leo Hagen from North Perth. Well, see, this is the thing. Schapelle fucking Corby. Does anybody actually care? Well, obviously somebody cares. Does any reasonable person give an absolute toss about what she did and what she's doing now? And another thing. When we look at the conditions in prison in Indonesia, this should be a cause for concern, and the solution shouldn't be get all Australians out of there. The solution should be, what the hell kind of country allows those kind of conditions? And the answer is, somewhere like Indonesia, that is pretty bloody poor. They've got very little money to spend on upgrading their prisons, and so when Australians get locked up in their prisons, the same as any of their criminals, they get bunged up in these hellholes, as they put it. And the solution then isn't to say, well, let's get all the Australians out. The solution is to say, we should be helping Indonesia to improve their situation. No wonder that the asylum seekers want to come here rather than stay in Indonesia, as people seem to think. And also, the other thing is, even if Chopper Reid did profit illegally, that is no argument to say, Schapelle Corby should be allowed to profit from her criminality. And the idea that we should just sneak her out if we could, and the only thing stopping us is an extradition treaty. Oh my God, what kind of privilege do you think we are as Australians? We just go, we're just going to ignore Indonesia because they're only a sovereign country to our north. Like, they're only our nearest neighbour. We should just completely ignore anything that they say just because, we want to get our people out. That is just crazy. Anyway, another letter from 22nd of February. An unseaworthy boat overloaded with people has left Indonesia. The passengers do not have identification. The boat is crewed by Indonesians and is not licensed to carry passengers. It has limited safety gear and the sea is choppy and dangerous. It is found in Australian waters by our Navy. To prevent passengers from being drowned, like many of before them, or finishing up in a detention camp, the Navy turns them back and in the process enters Indonesian waters. Who complains? Indonesia, about the Navy entering their waters. How many unseaworthy boats crewed by Indonesians containing passengers with no identification have entered Australian waters? Hundreds! I rest my case. Neil W. Trudgeon from Morley. The Navy's really doing a favour turning them back instead of taking them to a detention camp. Which detention camp? Oh, that's right, the ones that we banged up just to lock them up in under mandatory detention laws. Secondly, once we're out of Australian waters and the Navy is towing them back to Indonesia in international waters, that to me sounds more like piracy than anything that's permitted under law, especially. And thirdly, just because we don't want refugees coming by boat to our country, just because we don't want asylum seekers coming that way, does not give us the right to enter another country's territorial waters. We would not accept that same excuse from Indonesia. If we were sending people there, if Australians were crewing boats and going into Indonesian waters, we would not accept their Navy coming into our waters. It is an absolutely crazy argument. And to sort of pretend like we're doing them a favour because we're not banging them up, instead we're going to tow them back into Indonesian waters, is just absurd. And to suggest that we should be allowed to do that because we're Australia is just crazy talk. From yesterday, 24th of February 2014, Sir Francis Drought. California is in its third year of drought, and I noticed that analysis of the rings of the ancient sequoia trees indicate a drought event not seen since 1580, when Sir Francis Drake first arrived and claimed it for England. So, about 434 years ago, there was a similar drought event. I wonder where this sits in the global warming debate. David South, Bunbury. Where does it sit in the global warming debate? Oh, guess what? There was a drought 434 years ago that's similar to the drought event we're experiencing now. What does that tell us? That we haven't had such severe droughts for 434 years. This is kind of what we would expect. So the whole thing about the global warming thing is one of the main effects that we would actually start to notice in the short term is that we'll have an increase in extreme weather events. Now, a drought that's so severe that it hasn't happened for 434 years is pretty much the definition of an extreme weather event. So the fact that it's happening now is in line with the global warming predictions. If we get similar droughts happening more frequently, which is what was predicted, that would also be in line with and would be one of the predictions of the global warming thing. If we were to get no droughts like this in the areas where we were expecting them to get more frequent, that would go against it. That's not what's happening. Okay, so from today, 25th of February 2014, case Baby Feroz. An asylum-seeking family in Queensland, in a bid to stop their Australian-born baby from being deported to Nauru, have engaged lawyers to mount a High Court challenge against the federal government's refusal of a protection visa for the child. This is quite a slap in the face for the average citizen in Australia, where half of us couldn't afford a lawyer to represent us in a lower court, let alone the High Court. Ollie Renstead from Geraldton. Average Australians can't afford lawyers. That is a problem. The fact that an asylum-seeking family can have a lawyer in the High Court is not making that situation any worse. Here's the thing. Asylum seekers come here because they're fleeing persecution. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily poor. In fact, we don't refer to asylum seekers as economic migrants because they may not be poor. So the fact that they can afford a lawyer doesn't actually tell you anything about whether an asylum case is genuine or not. Secondly, they're almost certainly not actually that well off, and the lawyer is probably being paid for by charitable organisations to which people are donating money specifically for this kind of thing. That's what the charities do, looking after the poor and destitute. Thirdly, lawyers who generally are defending these refugees almost always do it for free or on a very reduced fee structure because they believe in the cause in which they're supporting. So the fact that they can afford it doesn't actually tell us anything, and distracts from the real point of your letter, which is actually that justice is not always affordable in Australia and is actually something that should be done with. So if you'd gotten rid of all the rest of the crap about the asylum seekers, you could have made a valid point. Well done. Next one, tomorrow is today. Joe Hockey's efforts to start discussions on the need to raise the pension age, as well as other possible welfare reforms, should be condemned. Australia's federal government, like many Western governments, is drowning in debt, thanks in large part to unabated spending on welfare over the past few decades. Welfare should only be made available to assist people through difficult times, not something that people stay on for life. Welfare is not meant to be for those that have lived their lives like there's no tomorrow. Australia can no longer afford such generous handouts. Australians should be made to plan for their own futures and not rely on governments to do it for them. Words such as compassion and charity should be replaced with more appropriate words, as they are simply unviable. Pete Bell, Balcada. Now, as a wise man once said, fuck the poor. More seriously though, welfare is, as you say, should be made available to assist people through difficult times. And that's pretty much what our welfare system was designed to do. The problem isn't that spending on welfare has gone up massively in the past years paying for poor people. The problem actually is that the Howard government in particular, and since then the Labor government that came afterwards to a lesser extent, have been directing huge amounts of welfare money to the middle class and people who don't need it. Here's the thing, we've got to the point where welfare payments now are considered kind of a bit odd if they are means tested. What's that mean? Means tested is where they take into account how much money and income you have before they decide whether to give you the welfare. That is, there's an awful lot of payments out there that the government is giving to people who already have income and assets. That is, people who don't really need it. So when we had our child, we got $2,000 from the federal government. We didn't need that money. It was nice, sure, but we didn't need it. We're not poor, but the government gives it. The government gives it to every single child that is born. Now, Yes, some of those children will be to poor families and the money's needed, but really shouldn't we be cutting back on the amount of money that's given to people who are millionaires or earning hundreds of thousands a year? The family tax benefit is similar. Big chunks of that we get paid purely because we have a child, nothing to do with our income. And this has actually been the massive increase in welfare over the last couple of decades. There's been increases in welfare to middle class people, and that's what should be cut back. Anybody who's getting the first home buyers grant, which is again not means tested, the federal government's private healthcare rebate, where the government chips in for your private health cover, not based on your income at all. Even the Abbott government was their policy they took to the last election that they were voted on for maternity leave, paid maternity leave, was that the person staying at home, the mum usually, but actually it could be the dad, would be paid their full wage up to something like $150,000 a year for the 6 months that they're at home. So that's up to $75,000. Disproportionately, that money would be going to people who do not need it, people who do not need the government's welfare. That's where a lot of this money is being wasted, and that's where it should be clawed back. Tyrant admonished, also from today. With the subject of bullying coming up, I think my account of our local bully, Bill, may be of interest. When young people, especially girls, passed Bill's house, he would run out and punch them. Visits by the parents of the punched and the police came to naught. One morning, when I was 8 years old, my mother watched me safely across the highway, and when she turned to wave to me, I was crying. Mum came to me to ask the reason for my tears. Bill punched me hard in the stomach. We walked a few yards to the bus stop where Bill was waiting with other boys. Are you Bill? My mother asked, grabbing his arm. Yes. Mum slapped Bill hard across his cheek. Illegal? Probably. Effective? Very. End of Bill's reign of terror. Winifred Klomp, Como. Yes, because we all know that assaulting bullies is the best solution. End of sarcasm. Whenever I hate to tell you this, but the evidence is very, very clear-cut, and that corporal punishment, especially of bullies, does nothing to reduce their bullying. In fact, at best you can hope that it will displace it, so that your child is no longer bullied and they'll take it out on somebody else, probably their younger sibling. We understand the causes of bullying. We actually understand some of the best treatments of it. Nobody really wants to hear it, because it turns out that most bullies themselves have been victimised. Most bullies bully because they are being bullied. And so the evidence actually is around we should treat them as human beings and do something with that. But you know what? It's so much simpler to just hit them, especially when they're smaller than you, hey? Alright, till next time, I'll keep reading the West. You have a nice life.